The showroom of Sterling and Cross Vintage Auto sat beneath perfectly calibrated halogen lights that washed every vehicle in the room with a cold, expensive glow. A 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air rested on a rotating platform near the center of the floor. Its restoration cost alone listed at $87,613.42 on a discreet brass plaque. A classic Porsche valued at $214,500 reflected the overhead lights so sharply it almost hurt to look at. Everything inside the building had been designed to make visitors feel small. It worked. At exactly 10:14 a.m., the heavy glass entrance doors opened, and Shaquille O'Neal stepped inside. The giant had to lower his head slightly to clear the frame. He wore a faded gray zip-up hoodie that looked like it had survived several winters, dark denim jeans with faint wear marks around the knees, and a pair of well-used sneakers that had seen better days. The scent of recent rain still clung lightly to the fabric of his jacket from the overcast California morning outside. Nobody greeted him. Three sales associates, standing near an espresso station, stopped talking in the middle of a conversation about golf memberships. One woman slowly lowered her coffee cup without taking a sip. Another salesman glanced toward the reception desk, waiting for somebody else to deal with the situation. Nobody moved. The silence arrived almost instantly. Not the comfortable kind. The judgmental kind. A man in a navy blazer quietly shifted a leather catalog off a nearby table as Shaq walked past, as if the 7'1" stranger might somehow damage it by proximity alone. A receptionist with the gold nameplate reading. Melissa looked down at her computer screen with sudden fascination. Her keyboard wasn't even moving. Across the showroom, two wealthy clients sat in cream-colored lounge chairs, sipping complimentary espresso. One of them looked Shaq up and down, paused for a moment, then leaned toward his friend. Neither bothered lowering their voices. "Wrong place, buddy." His friend chuckled. "Maybe he's looking for the public restroom." The joke landed exactly where they intended. Neither man knew who Shaquille O'Neal was. The funny thing was, Shaq knew exactly what they were doing. And he didn't care. Years of fame had taught him something most people never learn. When strangers decided who you were within 3 seconds, correcting them usually wasted 5 minutes. He continued walking, slowly, calmly. The polished marble floor reflected his massive frame as he moved deeper into the showroom. His eyes passed over a restored Mustang, a vintage Corvette, and a rare Jaguar E-Type before settling briefly on a vehicle near the far corner of the building. His expression changed for less than a second. Then it disappeared. A salesman noticed. The salesman's name was Derek Holt, 36 years old, recently divorced and obsessed with commissions. He immediately walked toward the giant customer, not because he wanted to help, but because he wanted to prevent problems. The smile on his face looked professionally manufactured. "Morning," Derek said. "Can I help you with something?" Shaq looked at him. "Just looking around," Derek nodded. The smile remained. Only the smile. "Of course. We usually schedule appointments for private viewings. I don't need one. Most of our inventory isn't accessible without a sales representative. I can see it from here." For a brief moment, Derek looked annoyed. Then the smile returned. "We have several dealerships nearby that might fit different budgets." Shaq almost laughed. Almost. Instead, he glanced at the price tag hanging from a nearby Porsche. "I see." Derek followed his gaze. "Beautiful car." "It is. Most people don't realize maintenance alone can run over $10,000 annually." Shaq nodded. Again, calmly, Derek kept talking. "The way people do when they mistake patience for ignorance. We try to make sure our clients understand the level of investment required before becoming emotionally attached." The sentence hung in the air for a second. Then another. The giant simply stared at the car. Derek eventually cleared his throat. "Do you understand what I'm saying?" "Yeah, and?" Shaq finally turned toward him. The giant's face remained completely neutral. "I understand you're worried about something." The answer caught Derek off guard. "What do you mean?" Shaq glanced around the showroom. The cars seemed fine. A couple standing near the espresso bar suddenly looked away to hide their smiles. Derek didn't. His jaw tightened slightly. For the first time he seemed unsure whether he was talking to somebody clueless or somebody much smarter than he expected. Neither option made him comfortable. A wall-mounted television near the customer lounge quietly displayed financial news. The scrolling ticker reported that the stock market had gained 117 points during early trading. Soft jazz music played through hidden speakers. Somewhere in the back office, a printer hummed to life. Everything inside Sterling and Cross continued functioning with mechanical precision, except the atmosphere. That kept getting colder. Shaq continued moving through the showroom at an unhurried pace while employees tracked him with their eyes. Every few steps, conversation stopped. Every pause drew attention. Every glance seemed to carry an unspoken question. What was he doing here? Nobody asked directly. They didn't need to. Their faces already had. Near the center of the room stood a polished steel information pillar listing the dealership's values: excellence, heritage, prestige, respect. The last word almost made Shaq smile. Almost, because not a single person had shown him any. As he approached the far side of the showroom, he finally stopped walking. The vehicle waiting there sat beneath its own dedicated lighting display. His eyes settled on it. Not the price, not the badge, the vehicle itself. For the first time since entering the building, he looked genuinely interested. And from across the showroom floor, several employees immediately noticed, including one man in a sharply tailored charcoal suit who had been watching everything from his office doorway. Vance Sterling slowly adjusted his silver cufflinks. Then he started walking toward him. Before we go any further, have you ever walked into a place with money in your pocket and been treated like you didn't belong there, simply because of how you looked? Tell us in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about dignity, respect, and real character, subscribe for more. Vance Sterling adjusted his silver cufflinks as he closed the distance. The director of Sterling and Cross Vintage Auto moved with the confidence of a man who had spent 22 years convincing wealthy people that owning expensive things made them exceptional. At 48 years old, Vance had built his reputation around exclusivity, image, and status. He sold classic cars, but what he really marketed was the feeling that certain people belonged in the room while others did not. And in his mind, Shaquille O'Neal did not belong. Not dressed like that, not standing there, not touching one of his cars. The marble floor clicked softly beneath Vance's Italian leather shoes as he approached the giant from the side. Several employees immediately stopped pretending to work and began watching openly. Even the clients in the lounge shifted their attention toward the developing confrontation. Nobody wanted to miss the show. Vance stepped directly into Shaq's path. The giant stopped. Vance did not offer a handshake. He did not introduce himself. He simply planted both feet firmly on the floor, creating a physical barrier between Shaq and the vehicle he had been studying. The message was obvious. You go no farther. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The contrast between them was almost absurd. One wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most used cars. The other wore a faded hoodie that looked like it came from a discount rack. One looked desperate to impress everyone around him. The other looked like he had absolutely nothing to prove. Vance broke the silence first. Can I help you? His tone suggested the opposite. Shaq glanced briefly toward the Bronco behind him. I'm looking at that vehicle. Vance followed the direction of his gaze. His lips tightened. That vehicle isn't available for casual viewing. Shaq looked back at him. Seems available. I'm viewing it. A nervous laugh escaped from somewhere near the espresso station. Someone quickly covered it with a cough. Vance's expression hardened. The Bronco is part of a premium inventory collection. Okay. We reserve access for qualified buyers. Okay. Every answer was calm. Every answer made Vance more irritated. The director had expected defensiveness, anger, maybe embarrassment. Instead, he was getting polite indifference, and somehow that felt more insulting. Vance folded his arms. What exactly are you doing here? Shaq shrugged. Looking at cars. No, I mean specifically. The giant stared at him for a moment. That's pretty specific. Another employee looked down to hide a smile. Vance noticed. His face reddened slightly. The situation was no longer going according to his script. Usually people apologized. Usually they left. Usually they understood their place. This man wasn't cooperating. Vance lowered his voice. We're a private dealership, I noticed. Our clients schedule appointments. I didn't. Our inventory attracts serious collectors. Shaq nodded. Looks that way. The director exhaled slowly through his nose. Talking to this man felt like punching a mattress. Nothing bounced back, nothing landed. Nearby, Melissa at the reception desk pretended to organize paperwork while listening to every word. Derek Holt stood near a display case, pretending to inspect brochures. The wealthy customers in the lounge had completely abandoned their espresso conversation. Everybody was watching. Nobody was helping. Vance took a step closer. Listen carefully. His voice became sharper. This dealership caters to a very specific clientele. Shaq remained silent. The vehicles here aren't toys. Still nothing. We're talking about assets worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Shaq looked around the showroom. Yeah, the price tags are pretty visible. The response hit harder than an insult, because it exposed exactly what Vance was doing. The director wasn't educating him. He was judging him, and now everyone could see it. A muscle twitched in Vance's jaw. For the first time, he stopped trying to sound professional. I think you've spent enough time here. The room became noticeably quieter. Even the jazz music suddenly seemed too loud. Shaq looked directly at him. You closing early? A couple near the lounge nearly choked on their coffee. Vance wasn't amused, not even a little. You need to leave. There it was, finally. No more disguises, no more corporate language, just raw exclusion. Shaq studied the man's face. Years of experience had taught him something important. People usually revealed themselves when they thought nobody could challenge them. Vance looked completely comfortable. That told him everything. The director pointed toward the glass entrance. I don't know what brought you here. I drove. Vance ignored the answer. But this isn't the place for you. The giant remained still. For a brief moment, the two men stared at each other across only a few feet of polished marble. One was trying to establish dominance. The other was trying to understand what kind of person stood in front of him. The answer was becoming clearer by the second. Vance straightened his jacket. I'll make this simple. His voice carried far enough for half the showroom to hear. You need to leave immediately. Nobody spoke. Nobody objected. Several employees suddenly became fascinated by their computer screens. The clients in the lounge watched with open curiosity. One of them even smiled, because some people enjoy seeing others humiliated, as long as they're not the target. Shaq slowly shifted his attention away from Vance. His eyes moved past the director, past the expensive Porsche, past the reception desk, and settled once more, sitting quietly beneath the dedicated lights at the far end of the showroom. The 1969 Ford Bronco. The reason he had driven across California that morning. The reason he had spent 4 months tracking ownership records, restoration histories, and auction transfers. The reason he wasn't leaving. Not yet. Vance noticed where he was looking, and for the first time, genuine suspicion crossed the director's face. Because despite everything he had said, the giant still wasn't interested in arguing. He wasn't interested in impressing anyone. He wasn't interested in proving he belonged. He only cared about that Bronco. And Vance suddenly realized he had no idea why. Shaq kept his eyes on the Bronco. Vance Sterling was still standing in front of him, still waiting for compliance, still convinced that enough pressure would eventually force the giant toward the exit. The director had spent most of his career dealing with people who cared deeply about appearances. He understood status, insecurity, and ego. What he didn't understand was someone who seemed completely unaffected by all three. That made him uncomfortable. The Bronco sat quietly beneath a dedicated lighting display near the corner of the showroom. Unlike the polished Porsche and the gleaming Corvette, it wasn't flashy. Its deep forest green paint carried a few tiny imperfections that had been intentionally preserved during restoration. The chrome wasn't oversized, the wheels weren't customized. It looked practical, honest, useful, which was probably why Shaq liked it. Most people walking through Sterling and Cross never gave the Bronco more than a passing glance. Wealthy collectors preferred vehicles that attracted attention. The Bronco attracted memories, and memories were exactly why Shaq was there. 30 years earlier, long before endorsement deals and championship rings, there had been a high school coach named Walter Briggs. Coach Briggs never drove anything fancy. He couldn't afford to. The man spent most of his paycheck helping kids who couldn't afford tournament fees, replacement shoes, or bus tickets. When a player needed help, Coach Briggs somehow found a way to make it happen. Nobody ever knew how. The old Bronco was part of that story. The vehicle had over 280,000 miles on it before the odometer finally stopped working. Coach Briggs drove it through rainstorms, summer heat, and roads that should have been condemned by local government agencies. The Bronco never complained. Neither did Coach Briggs, at least not where anyone could hear. Shaq remembered one December tournament in particular. The temperature had dropped below freezing. The school's transportation budget had been cut again. The district couldn't provide a bus. Several players assumed they would miss the tournament entirely. Coach Briggs showed up at 5 in the morning. The Bronco was already running. The heater wasn't. 8 teenage basketball players spent 3 hours wrapped in donated blankets while Coach Briggs drove through icy roads toward Bakersfield. Every few minutes he apologized for the cold. Nobody blamed him. They were there because of him. The memory still made Shaq smile, barely. Back in the showroom, Vance continued watching him. The director couldn't understand why someone who supposedly didn't belong there remained interested in a vehicle that wasn't even the most expensive car on the floor. "What's so special about that one?" Vance finally asked. Shaq glanced toward him. "Personal reasons. You're very interested in it." Vance folded his arms. "You restoring one at home?" "No." The answer ended there. The director hated short answers. He preferred conversations where he controlled the flow. This one felt like trying to interrogate a stone wall. Meanwhile, Shaq's attention returned to the Bronco. 4 months. That's how long he had spent tracking it. The search had started in Oregon, moved through Nevada, and eventually led to a private collector outside Sacramento. The collector sold it to Sterling and Cross 6 months earlier during an estate liquidation. The chassis number matched. The restoration records matched. Everything matched. This was the vehicle. The exact vehicle, not a replica, not a similar model. The Bronco Coach Briggs had driven for years. Most people would never understand why that mattered. Shaq did. 3 weeks earlier, he had received a phone call from an old teammate. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. It changed everything. Coach Briggs' widow, Eleanor Briggs, was 72 years old and living alone outside Fresno. Medical expenses had drained most of her savings after her husband's final illness. Property taxes had increased. Utility costs kept climbing. The winter heating bills were becoming a problem. She never asked anyone for help. That part sounded familiar. Pride and dignity often traveled together, especially among people who spent their lives helping others. Shaq had quietly looked into her situation afterward. Everything he learned bothered him. Not because she was struggling, because nobody knew. The woman whose husband had helped hundreds of kids was sitting alone trying to decide whether she should lower the thermostat to save money. Life wasn't always fair. Sometimes it was embarrassingly unfair. The billionaire could have mailed her a check. That would have been easy, too easy. Coach Briggs deserved better than easy. The old coach had spent decades giving kids memories that lasted forever. Shaq wanted to return one. The Bronco wasn't transportation. It was history. It was gratitude. It was a thank you that had arrived 30 years late. Across the showroom floor, 2 clients continued watching the confrontation unfold. One leaned toward the other. "I still don't understand why he's here." His friend shrugged. "Maybe he's confused." Neither man had any idea how wrong they were. Shaq probably could have purchased every vehicle in the building before lunch. But that wasn't the point. The point was sitting in a small house near Fresno, completely unaware that an old piece of her husband's life was only days away from coming home. The thought warmed him. For the first time that morning, the cold atmosphere inside Sterling and Cross didn't seem quite as important. Vance interrupted his thoughts. "I'm going to ask one final time." His voice had become noticeably harder. "If you're not conducting business, you need to leave." Shaq looked at him calmly. The director saw a giant wearing an old hoodie. The employees saw a customer who didn't fit the image. The clients saw an outsider. Nobody in the room saw what was actually happening. Nobody knew about the freezing tournament mornings. Nobody knew about Coach Briggs. Nobody knew about Eleanor. Nobody knew that every minute they spent trying to remove him from the building only delayed an act of kindness. Shaq slipped his hands deeper into his jacket pockets. Then his eyes settled on the Bronco one more time, and Vance's patience finally began to crack. Vance's patience finally began to crack. The director stared at the giant standing calmly in front of him and realized something he absolutely hated. Every tactic that normally worked was failing. The subtle insults hadn't worked. The social pressure hadn't worked. The repeated demands hadn't worked. And worst of all, people were starting to notice. At 10:22 a.m., Vance snapped his fingers sharply toward the rear administration corridor. The sound echoed across the showroom. Several employees immediately knew what it meant. Two security guards appeared less than 10 seconds later. Both men wore black uniforms with Sterling and Cross security patches sewn onto their sleeves. Their names were Cole Ramirez and Trent Holloway, former private security contractors who now spent most days preventing customers from touching cars they couldn't afford. This was not one of those situations. But neither man asked questions. They simply responded. The guards walked forward with measured, deliberate steps. Their hands rested casually near their tactical belts. Not threatening enough to create legal problems. Just threatening enough to make a point. The atmosphere inside the showroom changed instantly. Even the wealthy clients sitting in the lounge straightened in their chairs. Everybody sensed where this was heading. Vance welcomed the audience. In fact, he wanted one. The director turned slightly toward the lounge area before speaking. His voice became noticeably louder. "Sir, I'm asking you to leave private property." Several heads turned. Not because they hadn't heard him before, because now he wanted them to hear him. The three clients, sipping espresso, immediately stopped pretending they weren't watching. One of them crossed his arms. Another leaned back comfortably, enjoying the spectacle. Nothing entertains certain people more than watching someone else get embarrassed, especially when they think the target deserves it. Shaq remained still. His eyes drifted briefly toward the approaching guards before returning to the Bronco. That only irritated Vance further. The man wasn't even acknowledging the threat. Cole stopped several feet away. Trent positioned himself slightly to the side. The formation wasn't accidental. It limited movement, created pressure, made the target feel surrounded. At least that was the idea. The giant didn't seem impressed. Vance pointed toward the entrance. "You're creating a disturbance." For the first time, Shaq looked directly at him. "A disturbance? Yes. I've barely spoken." Several employees immediately looked down. Because he was right. Everyone knew he was right. Vance had been doing almost all the talking. The director ignored the observation. "This dealership has the right to refuse service." "Okay." The answer landed like a brick. No argument, no anger, no resistance, just calm acceptance, which somehow made Vance look even worse. The director had expected confrontation. Instead, he looked like a man trying to start a fight with someone reading a weather report. One of the clients near the espresso bar chuckled quietly. Not at Shaq, at Vance. The director heard it. His face tightened. Public embarrassment had always been his greatest weakness. The more exposed he felt, the more aggressive he became. Cole shifted uncomfortably. Unlike Vance, the security guard wasn't enjoying this. He had spent enough years working crowd control to recognize genuinely dangerous people. The giant wasn't displaying any warning signs. No clenched fists, no raised voice, no aggressive posture. Nothing. Just a large man standing quietly beside a vintage Bronco. Trent noticed the same thing. The two guards exchanged a brief glance. Neither liked where this was going. Unfortunately, neither worked for themselves. Vance took another step forward. His expensive cologne mixed strangely with the scent of polished leather and fresh espresso. "You've been asked repeatedly to leave." Shaq nodded. "That's true. Then why are you still here?" The giant looked toward the Bronco again. "Because I'm interested in that vehicle." The answer was simple, honest, perfectly reasonable. Vance treated it like a personal insult. "No." His voice rose noticeably. "You are not interested in that vehicle." The statement hung in the air. A few employees exchanged confused looks. Even Derek Holt frowned. Because Vance had crossed an invisible line. There was arrogance. Then there was deciding what another person was allowed to want. Shaq's expression remained unchanged. "That's interesting." "What is?" "You seem to know a lot about me." A nervous laugh escaped from someone near the reception desk. Melissa immediately looked away. Vance was no longer in control of the room. Everyone could feel it. That realization made him reckless. The director turned toward the guards. "Escort him out." Silence. Nobody moved immediately. Not because the guards were refusing. Because the order sounded ridiculous. Cole looked at Shaq, then looked at Vance, then looked back at Shaq. The giant was nearly a foot taller than both guards, and yet somehow he looked like the least threatening person in the room. "Sir," Cole said carefully, "would you be willing to step outside so we can talk?" The difference was obvious. Cole was trying to de-escalate. Vance was trying to humiliate. Shaq looked at the guard, then at the Bronco, then back at the guard. "I'm not causing a problem. No one's saying you are." Vance immediately interrupted. "I am." Cole closed his eyes briefly, just for a second. That tiny reaction didn't escape several employees. Neither did the uncomfortable expression on Trent's face. The situation had become awkward for everyone except the man creating it. The wealthy clients who had initially enjoyed the spectacle were beginning to shift in their seats, because the longer it continued, the harder it became to justify. There was no angry customer, no dangerous behavior, no disruption. Just a director determined to remove someone for reasons he couldn't openly admit, and everybody knew it. Vance's voice echoed through the showroom again. "Either he leaves voluntarily or we remove him." The sentence finally created a visible reaction. Not from Shaq, from the staff. Derek looked away. Melissa stared at her desk. A detail manager near the service entrance quietly shook his head. "Obok." Because speaking carried consequences. Sterling and Cross paid well. People had mortgages, car payments, medical bills. Principals were expensive. Vance knew that. That's why he relied on silence. But as the guard stood there and the giant remained calm, another employee watched from farther back near the appraisal department. A 29-year-old junior appraiser holding a maintenance clipboard. Arthur Pendleton. Unlike everyone else, Arthur wasn't looking at Shaq. He was looking at Vance, and the longer he watched, the less comfortable he became. Because what started as arrogance was beginning to look a lot like cruelty, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could stand there and pretend otherwise. Arthur Pendleton tightened his grip on the clipboard. The junior appraiser had spent the last 4 minutes watching something that made his stomach increasingly uncomfortable. At first, he told himself it wasn't his business. Then he told himself management would handle it. After that, he tried convincing himself he needed the paycheck more than he needed an opinion. None of those arguments worked, because the truth was standing right in front of him, and the truth looked ugly. Arthur was 29 years old, drove a 12-year-old Honda Accord with 187,000 miles on it, and had exactly 412 16s in his checking account. 3 unopened final notices sat on his kitchen counter at home. His mother's care facility payment was due in 11 days. He knew the date because he thought about it every morning and every night. His health insurance came through Sterling and Cross. Without that insurance, his mother's monthly medication costs would jump from $183 to nearly $900. The math wasn't complicated. Lose the job, lose the insurance, lose options. Arthur understood all of that, which was exactly why stepping forward felt so stupid. Yet somehow he did it anyway. The moment finished saying, "Either he leaves voluntarily or we remove him," Arthur started walking. One step, then another, then a third. Several employees immediately noticed. Derek Holt's eyes widened. Melissa stopped pretending to type. Even the security guards looked confused. Arthur wasn't management, he wasn't senior staff, he wasn't important. He was just the guy who spent most days reviewing maintenance records and verifying restoration histories. Nobody expected him to get involved, especially not now. Arthur moved directly between the guards and Shaq. The showroom went silent, not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that makes people stop breathing for a second. Vance stared at him. "What are you doing?" Arthur swallowed. For a brief moment, fear hit him hard enough to make his knees feel weak. Then he spoke anyway. "He's not causing a problem." The sentence sounded much smaller out loud than it had inside his head. But it was enough. Vance blinked. Not because of what Arthur said, because someone had actually said it. Out loud, in front of witnesses. The director's expression darkened immediately. "Excuse me?" Arthur felt every pair of eyes in the room swing toward him. His pulse climbed, fast. Still, he didn't move. He hasn't damaged anything. Nobody spoke. He hasn't threatened anyone. The room remained frozen. He hasn't even raised his voice. Now even the wealthy clients in the lounge were listening carefully, because something had changed. The giant customer wasn't the center of attention anymore. Arthur was, and everyone knew it. Laughed once, a short, humorless laugh. "You want to tell me how to run my dealership?" "No." "Good." Arthur nodded, then ruined the moment. But I think we're handling this wrong. A couple near the espresso station exchanged glances. One employee quietly whispered, "Oh no," because everyone knew what happened to people who publicly challenged Vance Sterling. The man held grudges like family heirlooms. Arthur knew it too, but once the words started coming out, he couldn't stop them. He wants to look at a vehicle. That's not your concern. He's still a customer. Vance's jaw tightened. No. The director pointed directly at Shaq. He's not. The sentence landed heavily, because everybody understood what it meant. Nobody wanted to acknowledge it, but everybody understood it. Arthur looked toward Shaq for the first time. The giant remained completely calm, no anger, no encouragement, no expectation. If anything, he looked surprised, as though he hadn't expected anyone to step in. Arthur understood that feeling. Sometimes doing the right thing felt lonely because it usually was. Vance folded his arms. "You need to get back to work." Arthur should have listened. Every logical part of his brain told him to listen. Instead, he looked toward the Bronco, then back at Vance. If he's interested in buying it, shouldn't someone at least answer his questions? The room became painfully quiet. The logic was impossible to argue with, which is exactly why Vance didn't address it. Instead, he attacked, very concerned about this. Arthur immediately recognized the trap. Vance wasn't having a conversation anymore. He was building a case. The director did that whenever he wanted to punish someone. Every employee knew the pattern. Arthur felt his chest tighten. "Still," he answered, "I think everybody deserves basic respect." The statement sounded simple. It wasn't. Not inside Sterling and Cross, not with Vance standing there. The director's face hardened. For several seconds, he simply stared. The kind of stare supervisors use when mentally calculating consequences. Finally, he spoke. "You work in appraisal?" "Yes." "Then appraise cars." A few uncomfortable laughs appeared around the room. Nobody thought it was funny. People laughed because they were scared. Arthur recognized that too. Fear had a sound, and he was hearing it. Vance pointed toward the rear offices. "Last warning." Arthur didn't move, neither did the guards. Cole and Trent suddenly looked like two men who desperately wished they were somewhere else, because the situation no longer involved security. Now it involved character, and character was messy. The director looked ready to explode. Arthur looked ready to lose his job. The staff looked ready to disappear into the floor. Meanwhile, Shaq quietly observed everything. The giant had met thousands of people during his life. Athletes, executives, celebrities, billionaires. But every now and then, someone impressed him more than all of them. Usually it was somebody with very little to gain, and a lot to lose. Arthur clearly fell into that category. The young appraiser wasn't standing there because it benefited him. It didn't. He wasn't standing there because he felt brave. His shaking hands suggested otherwise. He was standing there because he knew something was wrong and couldn't convince himself to ignore it. That kind of courage rarely looked dramatic. Most of the time it looked terrified. Arthur swallowed again and adjusted the maintenance clipboard against his chest. The movement was small, but it felt like drawing a line in the sand. Because deep down he already knew how this story probably ended for him. What he didn't know was that the quiet giant behind him had just started paying very close attention. Arthur adjusted the clipboard against his chest and made a decision. If he was already in trouble, he might as well do his job. The young appraiser turned toward Shaq and ignored the furious stare burning into the side of his head. "Would you like to see the vehicle up close?" For a moment, nobody moved. The question sounded completely normal. That was exactly why it felt so shocking. Vance Sterling looked as though Arthur had just set fire to the showroom. The giant answered first. "Yeah." Arthur nodded. "Right this way." The two men walked toward the Bronco. The security guards stepped aside almost immediately. Cole Ramirez looked relieved to have something resembling a professional interaction happening again. Trent Holloway quietly exhaled through his nose and took 2 steps backward. Neither guard followed, neither wanted any part of what came next. Behind them, Vance remained frozen. The director's face had turned an unhealthy shade of red. Still, he said nothing. Not yet. Arthur stopped beside the Bronco and rested his hand lightly on the front fender. Up close, the vehicle looked even better. The restoration team had preserved its history without turning it into a museum piece. Tiny signs of age remained visible beneath the fresh paint. The Bronco still looked like something a person could drive, rather than lock away inside a climate-controlled garage. Arthur understood why serious collectors loved vehicles like this. They had stories, and stories mattered. This restoration took a little over 400 hours, Arthur said. Shaq listened carefully, not politely, genuinely. That surprised Arthur. Most wealthy clients barely paid attention to technical details. They cared about rarity, auction values, and future appreciation. The giant seemed interested in the machine itself. The engine was completely rebuilt, Arthur continued. Original 302 V8 block. New pistons, new bearings. Compression tested at every stage. Shaq nodded. What about the transmission? Arthur smiled slightly. First real question, C4 automatic. Rebuilt during restoration. Less than 200 miles since completion. The giant walked slowly around the vehicle. What about rust? Frame was stripped to bare metal. Any structural repairs, rear cross-member replacement professionally documented? Suspension? Arthur flipped through the maintenance records, original geometry preserved. Modern bushings installed, new shocks, new spring springs. The giant nodded again. The questions kept coming. Not random questions, precise questions. The kind of questions asked by somebody who actually understood vehicles. Arthur found himself relaxing. For the first time all morning, he wasn't dealing with drama. He was talking about a car. It felt refreshing. Nearby, Vance paced slowly across the marble floor like a man trying to contain a volcanic eruption. Every answer Arthur provided seemed to make him angrier, because the conversation looked normal, professional, respectful. Everything Vance had tried to prevent. The wealthy clients in the lounge were watching again. Only now their expressions had changed. The giant customer no longer looked out of place. He looked informed. One client quietly lowered his espresso cup. The other stopped smiling. Reality had started interfering with assumptions. Meanwhile, Arthur opened the driver's door. The interior smelled faintly of leather and machine oil. Seats were reupholstered 6 months ago. Shaq leaned inside. What about the electrical system? Fully rewired. Original gauges? Refurbished. Air conditioning? Arthur laughed. No. Whoever owned this thing originally apparently believed suffering built character. For the first time all morning, Shaq laughed too. A deep rumbling laugh. Several employees glanced over. The sound immediately changed the atmosphere. Not dramatically. Just enough. Because suddenly the giant wasn't an intruder, he was a customer having a conversation. The difference mattered. Arthur continued reviewing records. The restoration documentation is complete. Every invoice, every repair, every inspection. How many owners? 3 confirmed. Any accidents? None documented. Original chassis? Arthur pointed toward the paperwork. That answer held extra weight. Shaq looked at the Bronco for several seconds, longer than before. The vehicle wasn't just transportation. Arthur could see that much. Something about it mattered. He didn't know why, but he could tell. People always looked different when they were staring at a memory. At 10:31 a.m., Arthur closed the maintenance folder. The transaction had reached its natural point. There were no more questions, no more details, only the decision. The operator glanced at the paperwork, then at Shaq. The asking price is $118,450. Silence, no negotiation, no hesitation, no performance. The giant simply reached into his hoodie pocket. Arthur expected a phone, maybe a wallet. Instead, Shaq produced a solid black card, not flashy, not gold, not decorated, just black. Arthur had seen enough luxury purchases to recognize what it was. His eyes widened slightly. The surrounding staff noticed too. Even Vance stopped pacing. The card landed gently on the desk beside the paperwork. Shaq's voice remained calm. "I'll take it." Arthur blinked. "That's it? No financing? No inspection contingency? No. The giant looked mildly confused. "You already gave me the price." Arthur almost smiled. That answer somehow made perfect sense. The young appraiser processed the transaction terminal while half the showroom secretly watched. Melissa pretended to organize documents. Derek pretended to review inventory sheets. Nobody was fooling anyone. Every employee wanted to see what happened. Arthur inserted the card. The machine connected. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Proved. The receipt printer immediately came to life. The sound echoed through the showroom. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. The sale was complete, legitimate, undeniable. professional. Everything Vance Sterling had insisted was impossible had just happened in front of witnesses. Arthur slowly removed the printed receipt from the machine. The giant customer he had defended was now the owner of the Bronco, and judging by the expression spreading across Vance's face, the director had just experienced the most expensive mistake of his career. The receipt printer had barely gone silent when Vance Sterling exploded. The director crossed the showroom floor so fast that one of the lounge clients instinctively stepped out of his way. His polished shoes struck the marble with sharp, angry clicks. Every employee immediately recognized the expression on his face. Someone was about to pay for his embarrassment, and everyone knew who. Arthur had just finished handing the purchase documents to Shaq when Vance reached the desk. Without warning, the director snatched the maintenance clipboard from Arthur's hands. Then he slammed it onto the marble floor. Crack! The sound echoed through the showroom. Several employees flinched. A stack of inspection reports scattered across the floor like oversized playing cards. Restoration records slid beneath a nearby Corvette display. One page drifted all the way to the reception desk. Nobody moved to pick them up. Nobody wanted to get involved. Vance pointed directly at Arthur. "You are finished." The room froze. Arthur stared at him. For a brief second, he almost thought he had misheard. The director took another step forward. Effective immediately, the reality settled in. Not tomorrow, not next week, now. Vance's voice carried across the entire showroom. "You deliberately undermined management." Arthur remained silent. "You ignored direct instructions." Still silent, "You interfered with security procedures." Everyone knew that was nonsense. Nobody said it, because truth and job security often traveled in opposite directions. The director jabbed a finger toward the front entrance. "I am terminating your employment for gross insubordination." The words landed harder than Arthur expected, not because they were surprising, because hearing them out loud made everything real. The insurance, the bills, his mother, all of it, gone just like that. Arthur felt his stomach tighten. A week earlier, he had spent 43 minutes on the phone with the care facility discussing medication costs. 2 days earlier, he had delayed replacing a failing water heater because he couldn't afford both the repair and the next insurance copay. Now none of that mattered, because he no longer had a job. The irony almost made him laugh. Almost. Across the desk, Shaq watched quietly. The giant didn't interrupt, didn't step in. He simply observed. Vance turned toward the staff. His voice grew even louder. "Let this be a lesson." Several employees immediately looked away. The statement wasn't meant for Arthur. It was meant for them. The director was making an example. Publicly. Deliberately. "You don't tell me how to run this company." Nobody answered. The silence felt ugly. Arthur noticed something in that moment. Not a single employee looked happy. Not even the ones who usually tried to impress Vance. Melissa stared at her desk. Derek studied the floor. The detail manager near the service bay clenched his jaw. Everyone knew what was happening. Nobody felt good about it. That somehow made it worse. Because injustice becomes heavier when witnesses agree it's wrong. Cole Ramirez shifted uncomfortably beside the security station. The guard had been involved in hundreds of workplace disputes during his career. This wasn't one of them. Arthur hadn't threatened anyone, hadn't broken policy, hadn't damaged property. His real offense was embarrassing the wrong person. Cole knew it. Trent knew it. Everybody knew it. Vance didn't care. The director reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded termination form. The document looked suspiciously ready, almost as though he had used it before. Arthur wasn't surprised. "Turn in your badge." The words came coldly, mechanically, like the conclusion of a routine process. Arthur swallowed. For the first time all morning, genuine fear pushed past his composure. Not fear for himself. Fear for his mother. He pictured her room at the care facility, the framed photograph beside her bed, the weekly visits, the medications lined neatly inside a plastic organizer. Losing his job wasn't just losing a paycheck. Other people depended on that paycheck. That reality hit hard. Very hard. The showroom remained silent as Arthur slowly reached toward his shirt pocket. The Sterling and Cross name tag had been attached there for almost 4 years. 4 years of overtime, 4 years of skipped lunches, 4 years of helping build someone else's company. He unclipped it carefully. No dramatic gestures, no speeches, no anger. Just a simple motion. The tiny metal badge rested in his palm. For a moment he stared at it. Then he placed it on the desk. The sound was barely audible, yet somehow everyone heard it. Vance immediately grabbed it. The director looked satisfied. Not victorious, satisfied. Like a man who had restored order. That bothered several employees more than the firing itself, because Vance genuinely believed he was right. The wealthy clients in the lounge looked noticeably uncomfortable now. The entertainment value had disappeared. Humiliation was fun when it happened to strangers. Watching a decent employee lose his livelihood felt different. One of the clients quietly set down his coffee. The other checked his watch. Neither looked eager to continue shipping. Bad leadership had a way of contaminating a room. Arthur bent down and started collecting the papers scattered across the floor. Several sheets had slid beneath nearby displays. A few were crumpled. One had a muddy shoe print across it. Nobody helped, not because they didn't want to, because they were afraid. Arthur understood fear was expensive. He couldn't blame them. That didn't make it hurt less. A few feet away, Shaq finally spoke. Not loudly, not aggressively, just enough. Arthur, the young appraiser, looked up. The giant's expression remained calm, completely calm, which somehow felt more powerful than anger. You did your job. The statement was simple. Nothing more yet. Arthur felt something tighten in his throat, because throughout the entire confrontation, that was the first thing anyone had said. That sounded fair. Vance rolled his eyes. He's unemployed. Shaq looked at him. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt longer, much longer. The director expected an argument, expected outrage, expected a billionaire customer to throw his weight around. Instead, the giant simply picked up the purchase documents and folded them neatly. No threats, no lectures, no revenge. Nothing. That confused Vance more than anything, because he mistook restraint for weakness. Arthur finished gathering the final papers and placed them on the desk. His employment was over. His insurance was about to disappear. His future suddenly looked uncertain. And yet the strangest thing in the room wasn't the firing. It was the look on Shaq's face. Because the giant wasn't looking at Arthur like someone feeling sorry for him. He was looking at him like someone who had just made a decision. The giant wasn't looking at Arthur like someone feeling sorry for him. He was looking at him like someone who had just made a decision. The silence stretched across the showroom. Everybody felt it. Vance Sterling felt it. The employees felt it. Even the wealthy clients sitting in the lounge felt it, because people were waiting for something. A confrontation, a threat, a public humiliation, anything. The entire room expected Shaquille O'Neal to respond the way powerful people usually responded when someone crossed them. After all, everyone knew who he was now. The realization had spread quietly through the showroom during the transaction. Melissa had recognized him first, then Derek, then the clients in the lounge. By 10:42 a.m., the secret was gone. The giant standing beside the Bronco wasn't some random customer in a faded hoodie. He was Shaquille O'Neal, a man worth hundreds of millions of dollars. A man with connections, influence, lawyers, media access, and enough resources to make life very uncomfortable for anyone he chose. Vance knew it too. That was the problem. The director's confidence had started cracking the moment he realized who he had been talking to. But pride wouldn't allow him to back down now. Not publicly. Not in front of employees. Not in front of clients. So he stood there pretending everything remained under control. Nobody believed it, especially him. The showroom waited. Shaq calmly picked up the purchase documents. Then he picked up the keys. The small metal keyring looked almost comically tiny in his enormous hand. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The giant turned toward Vance. For the first time since entering the dealership, he looked directly into the director's eyes without distraction. The room somehow became even quieter. Vance straightened instinctively, preparing, bracing, expecting impact. Instead, he found something much worse. Nothing. No anger. No hatred. No outrage. No triumph. Nothing. Absolute indifference. The look lasted only a few seconds, yet it felt unbearable because Vance suddenly understood something he had never experienced before. The man standing in front of him didn't consider him important enough to hate. That realization landed harder than any insult. Throughout his career, Vance had measured his value through reactions. People admired him, feared him, envied him, argued with him. Those reactions made him feel significant. Shaq offered none of them. The giant looked at him the way someone looked at a parking meter. A temporary inconvenience. Nothing more. Vance opened his mouth, then closed it. For once, he had nothing to say. The Shaq turned away, just like that. No speech, no lecture, no dramatic final words. The giant simply walked toward the exit carrying the keys to the Bronco. Several employees watched him go. The wealthy clients watched too. Nobody understood what they were feeling. Relief, confusion, maybe disappointment. Human beings often expect fireworks. Real power rarely bothers. Cole Ramirez folded his arms and shook his head slightly. Trent looked toward the floor. Melissa stared after the departing giant. The atmosphere felt unfinished, as though something important had happened without anyone fully understanding it. Behind them, Vance attempted to recover. He adjusted his jacket, straightened his cuffs, tried to look composed. Unfortunately, public humiliation leaves fingerprints. Everyone could still see them. Arthur gathered the last of his paperwork from the desk. His termination was real. The practical consequences were already forming inside his head. The insurance cancellation, the job search, the phone call to his mother's care facility, the conversation he absolutely did not want to have. He felt exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. The kind of exhaustion that settles into a person's bones. Part of him wondered whether standing up had been worth it. Not because he regretted it, because consequences were easier to admire before they arrived. He placed the final folder into a cardboard document box. The box looked absurdly small. 4 years reduced to a box. Corporate America had a strange sense of humor. Arthur almost laughed. Almost. The giant reached the front doors. Then stopped. Several employees noticed immediately, so did Vance. The director's shoulders tightened. The room held its breath. Slowly, Shaq turned around. Not toward Vance, toward Arthur. The young appraiser looked up. The giant walked back across part of the showroom floor. Not enough to create drama, just enough to close the distance. Arthur frowned slightly. "What is it?" Shaq reached into the pocket of his hoodie. The movement immediately captured everyone's attention. Vance stared. Melissa stared. The clients stared. Even the security guards watched carefully. The giant pulled out a small folded piece of paper. Nothing fancy, just ordinary paper folded twice. No logo, no envelope, no explanation. He stepped close enough that nobody else could easily see the writing. Then he pressed it into Arthur's palm. The paper felt surprisingly heavy. Arthur looked confused. Shaq finally spoke. His voice remained low. "Be there Monday." Arthur blinked. "What?" 9 o'clock. The giant folded Arthur's fingers around the paper. "Don't be late." That was all. No further explanation, no business card, no grand announcement, nothing. The mystery only deepened. Arthur looked down at the folded paper, then back up. But Shaq had already turned away. The giant walked toward the entrance once more. Nobody stopped him. Nobody challenged him. Nobody spoke. The glass doors opened. Cool California air drifted briefly into the showroom. A moment later, the doors closed behind him, and he was gone. For several seconds, nobody moved. The silence remained. Not the uncomfortable silence from earlier. Something different. Something uncertain. Arthur slowly unfolded the paper. His eyes scanned the handwritten words. An address, Los Angeles? Nothing else? No explanation, no instructions. Just an address written in neat block letters. Arthur frowned. "What is it?" Melissa asked quietly from across the room. The young appraiser looked at the paper again, then at the closed doors, then back at the address. "I honestly have no idea." Across the showroom floor, Vance Sterling finally relaxed. The giant was gone. The problem was over. The director believed he had won. And sometimes the most dangerous moment in a person's life is when they become absolutely certain they've gotten away with something. At 7:46 a.m., exactly 43 days later, Vance Sterling pulled into the employee parking lot and immediately knew something was wrong. Not catastrophic, just wrong. The kind of wrong that makes a person stop before turning off the engine. The service bays behind Sterling and Cross Vintage Auto were usually alive by this hour. Air compressors hissed, tool carts rattled, engines growled from diagnostic tests. Someone was always arguing about football scores before the workday officially began. This morning there was nothing, no noise, no movement, no activity. The silence felt unnatural. Vance stepped out of his black Mercedes and frowned. The large service garage doors were open. The bays were empty, completely empty. For a second he wondered if there had been a scheduling error. Then he saw the toolboxes, 4 of them, rolling toward the exit. His stomach tightened. Technician turnover happened occasionally. One person leaving wasn't unusual. 4 elite technicians leaving on the same morning was a disaster. The first person he recognized was Kyle Mercer. Kyle had spent 11 years building a reputation as one of the finest vintage engine specialists in Southern California. Customers requested him by name. Collectors trusted his work. Competitors had tried hiring him for years. He always stayed until now. The second technician was Miguel Ortega. The third was Sean Maddox. The fourth was Richard Bell. Together, those 4 men represented almost 40 years of combined expertise, and all 4 were leaving at the same time. Vance immediately accelerated his pace. "What is this?" Nobody answered immediately. The technicians kept loading equipment. Tool chests, diagnostic scanners, personal equipment. Years of accumulated experience packed into metal boxes. Vance stopped beside Kyle. "What are you doing?" Kyle didn't even look up. "Leaving." The answer hit harder because of how casual it sounded. "You can't just leave." Kyle laughed. The sound wasn't friendly. "Actually, I can." Vance's jaw tightened. "We have contracts." "No." Kyle finally looked at him. "We had jobs. Past tense. The distinction mattered. Very much." Vance's eyes moved toward the street, and that's when he saw it. Across the road stood a building that had been vacant for almost 3 years. The old commercial property had once housed an industrial printing company before sitting abandoned behind faded chain-link fencing. Not anymore. The entire facility had been renovated. Fresh paint, new signage, new landscaping, new glass. Everything looked immaculate. Workers stood on hydraulic lifts bolting a massive sign above the entrance. The final letter clicked into place. Pendleton Bespoke Automotive. For several seconds, Vance simply stared. His brain struggled to process what he was seeing. Then reality arrived. Hard, very hard. Arthur. The realization landed like a hammer. The young appraiser. The employee he fired. The employee who left carrying a cardboard box and a folded piece of paper. Vance suddenly remembered the handwritten Los Angeles address. His stomach dropped. Across the street, activity buzzed everywhere. Technicians moved equipment into service bays. Office staff carried computers through the front entrance. Delivery trucks unloaded machinery. Customers were already arriving. Customers, plural. The place wasn't preparing to open. It was open. Vance felt cold despite the California sun, despite the rising temperature. Cold. Kyle slammed a toolbox drawer shut. The metallic bang echoed through the empty service bay. "You should see the facility." Vance turned toward him. "What?" 12,000 square feet. The technician smiled. Not cruelly, honestly, which somehow felt worse. They built it right. Another technician joined the conversation. "Climate-controlled restoration rooms." Miguel shook his head. "Best setup I've ever seen." Sean laughed. "And actual profit sharing." That one hurt, because Vance knew exactly why it mattered. For years, Sterling and Cross had relied on talented people while rewarding them as little as possible. The dealership looked luxurious in the showroom because money flowed upward. Employees knew it. They simply lacked alternatives. Until now. Across the street stood an alternative. A very well-funded alternative. And everyone knew exactly who had funded it. Vance looked toward the new building again. A familiar Bronco sat near the entrance. Forest green, immaculate. The same Bronco. The realization completed the puzzle. Shaquille O'Neal, the giant, never sought revenge. He never called reporters, never filed lawsuits, never posted online, never screamed. Instead, he built something. Something far more dangerous. Competition. Real competition. The kind that exposed weak leadership immediately. A service advisor emerged from the dealership carrying a resignation envelope. Then another. Then another. Vance watched in disbelief. The bleeding wasn't stopping, because the technicians weren't the only people leaving. They were simply the first. One service writer crossed the street, then a restoration specialist, then a parts coordinator. Each departure felt like another brick falling from a wall. Sterling and Cross still had the showroom, still had the inventory, still had the expensive lighting, but something essential was disappearing. The people, the talented people, the respected people, the people customers actually trusted. Without them, the building became decoration, an expensive shell, nothing more. At 8:03 a.m., Vance stormed back inside the dealership. The showroom looked exactly the same. The Porsche still gleamed beneath the lights. The marble floors still reflected the ceiling. The espresso machine still hummed quietly. Everything looked perfect, yet somehow it felt empty. The illusion had cracked. For years, Vance believed he was the reason Sterling and Cross succeeded. Now he was discovering a painful truth. Buildings don't create loyalty. Titles don't create loyalty. Fear doesn't create loyalty. People do, and he had spent years driving those people away. The director walked toward the front windows overlooking the street. Across the road, customers filled the parking lot of Pendleton Bespoke Automotive. Arthur stood near the entrance speaking with employees. Confident, relaxed, respected. Not because he owned the business, because people wanted to work with him. There was a difference. Vance stared through the glass. For the first time in 43 days, he finally understood what that silent look from Shaquille O'Neal had meant. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't mercy, it was certainty. Because while Vance spent 43 days believing he had won, somebody else had spent those same 43 days building the future directly across the street. Arthur switched off the final row of overhead lights at 7:15 p.m. The massive restoration floor of Pendleton Bespoke Automotive gradually settled into evening silence. Air compressors had stopped hours earlier. Welding stations sat dark. Tool carts stood neatly parked beside workbenches that would be busy again in the morning. The building looked nothing like the abandoned warehouse it had been 6 months ago. Now it was thriving. The facility covered nearly 12,000 square feet. Every service bay was booked 3 months in advance. Restoration projects arrived from 6 different states. Collectors who once spent fortunes at Sterling and Cross now drove past it without slowing down. Arthur still found that part funny. Not because of revenge, because Vance had spent years convincing people prestige lived inside a building. Turns out, prestige followed good people instead. The young business owner wiped grease from his hands with a shop rag and glanced toward his office. The office wasn't large, he preferred it that way. A desk, a computer, 2 chairs, no marble, no expensive artwork, no giant portrait of himself pretending to be important. Arthur had worked for one of those people already. Once was enough. He sat down and opened a secure financial portal on his computer. The account balance appeared instantly. $387,042.19. Arthur stared at the number for several seconds. Not because he was wealthy, because 6 months earlier he had been terrified. The account wasn't his, it belonged to his mother, a private medical trust, fully funded, protected, permanent. The monthly care bills were paid automatically now. The medications were covered. Specialist visits no longer required stressful phone calls or impossible budgeting decisions. For the first time in years, Arthur wasn't calculating what disaster might happen next. That feeling still seemed strange. Good strange. His phone buzzed. A text message appeared. "Mom, the nurses are tired of hearing me brag about you." Arthur laughed. A second message arrived. "Mom, I don't care." He smiled, then put the phone away. Some victories didn't need to be bigger than that. Outside, the sun was disappearing beyond the California skyline. The orange light filtered through the service bay windows and reflected softly off a row of restored classics worth several $1 million combined. A 1967 Mustang, a Shelby Cobra, a rare Jaguar E-Type, an Aston Martin restoration still waiting for final assembly. Beautiful machines, expensive machines, yet none of them were the reason Arthur looked forward to coming to work. The people were. The technicians who had followed him, the service advisors who finally felt respected, the younger apprentices learning skills instead of being treated like disposable labor. Those things mattered more. A sound echoed from the far end of the building. Arthur looked up. Someone was entering through the open garage bay. The figure had to duck slightly beneath the raised door. Arthur immediately recognized the oversized gray hoodie. Then came the laugh. Deep, unmistakable. The kind of laugh that arrived before the person did. Shaquille O'Neal walked into the garage carrying 2 pizza boxes. Arthur shook his head. "You flew across the country again, didn't you?" Shaq grinned. "Maybe. That's not an answer. It's the answer you're getting." Arthur laughed. Some things never changed. The giant set the pizza boxes on a nearby workbench. No assistants, no entourage, no cameras, just pizza. The 2 men grabbed a pair of overturned buckets and sat near the center service bay. Millions of dollars in restored automobiles surrounded them. Dinner cost $28.60. Life had a sense of humor. Steam rose from the pizza box as Arthur grabbed a slice. Pepperoni. Extra cheese. Nothing fancy. Shaq nodded approvingly. See? That's how you know the business is healthy. Arthur looked confused. What? If the owner still eats cheap pizza? Arthur laughed again. I think that's how accountants know the owner is unhealthy. Fair point. The garage filled with easy conversation. No business meeting, no agenda, just two people talking. Arthur eventually glanced across the shop floor. You know, everybody still asks how this happened. Shaq took another bite. They know how. You know what I mean. The giant nodded. Of course he knew. People wanted a dramatic answer. They wanted secret strategies. They wanted some complicated formula for success. The truth was disappointingly simple. You hired good people, Shaq said. Arthur shrugged. They were already good. Exactly, the answer hung there for a moment. Simple, accurate, complete. Across town, Sterling and Cross still existed, technically. The showroom remained open. The lights still worked. The marble floors still shined. But the place felt different now. Most of the talent had left. Many of the clients had followed. Revenue had fallen. Reputation had followed. Nobody needed to destroy the dealership. Its own leadership had done most of the work. Arthur looked toward the Bronco parked near the front office. The same Bronco. The vehicle that started everything. 3 months earlier, Eleanor Briggs had cried when she saw it. Not dramatic movie tears. Real ones. The kind people try to hide. She spent nearly an hour sitting behind the wheel touching familiar details she hadn't seen in decades. According to Shaq, she still drove it every Sunday. That made the entire journey worth it. Every part of it. The giant finished his final slice of pizza and leaned back slightly on the bucket. The garage had grown quiet, comfortably quiet, the best kind. Arthur looked around the building one more time. The employees had gone home. The work was finished. The bills were paid. His mother was safe, and for the first time in a very long time, tomorrow didn't scary. Shaq eventually stood and stretched. You did good. Arthur smiled. We did good. The giant considered the correction. Then nodded. Fair enough. The two men stood together beneath the service bay lights, while the last traces of daylight disappeared outside. Around them sat millions of dollars in rare metal, polished paint, and handcrafted machinery. Impressive things, valuable things, but none of them had built this place. The real engine had never been money. It wasn't status, it wasn't power, it wasn't even talent. It was something Vance Sterling never understood until it was too late. Dignity. Because dignity is the only currency that never depreciates.